Around 1,500 years ago, a young man who had left his worldly possessions behind and had abandoned a promising career took up residence in a cave on the side of a mountain some miles east of Rome. There he lived for 3 years, cold, destitute, alone, and seeking God. I would imagine that most passers-by would have wondered whether he had lost his mind. Would any one of them have guessed that the young man in the cave was, in fact, the seed from which Western civilization would eventually grow? In many ways, the figure we're about to consider is the most pivotal of all the pivotal players. For perhaps more than anyone else, St Benedict of Nursia contributed to the saving of Christian culture in the West. At a time when Roman order had collapsed and barbarian invaders were picking through the rubble of a once great civilization, Benedict founded the religious community that would, in time, preserve the best of the old and allow for the emergence of a particularly Christian way of life. And so, it is absolutely no exaggeration to say, without Benedict, there would be no Thomas Aquinas, no Catherine of Siena, no Ignatius of Loyola, no Michelangelo, and no John Henry Newman. Newman paid particularly eloquent tribute to the manner in which Benedict and his sons rebuilt a civilization. Silent men were observed about the country, digging, clearing, and building. And other silent men were sitting in the cold cloister while they painfully copied and recopied the manuscripts which they had saved. By degrees, the woody swamp became a hermitage, a religious house, a farm, an abbey, a village, a school of learning, and a city. Another of our pivotal players, G.K. Chesterton, reacting to critics in his own time who claimed that the church represented a return to the Dark Ages, said, "The only real light during the Dark Ages was the church. His reference was to the spiritual descendants of St Benedict, who relentlessly preserved Seneca, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, Aristophanes, Caesar. In fact, practically everything of value that we have from the ancient world. One of the most compelling questions of our time is whether another Benedictine moment might be upon us. That's to say, a time when the best of the classical culture must be preserved during a cultural crisis. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre famously opined, "We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, St. Benedict."
So if there was no Benedict, what would have happened to Catholicism?
God only knows. You know, I think of Kenneth Clark, the great art historian, cultural historian, and he said, you know, we got by the skin of our teeth. You know, that it was because of people like Benedict and some of those Irish monks who clung to the remnants of Western civilization, who preserved the scriptures and all that, that made Western civilization possible. If they weren't there, these people literally clinging to the edges, in some case, of the world, but clinging to the edges of a culture, we wouldn't have made it. And so I do think in God's providence, people like Benedict appeared. I mean, like a little seed, it's the mustard seed principle. From that little beginning came this great flowering. But without them, I don't know. I mean, civilizations can utterly collapse. It's a lot of evidence of that. Could have happened to Christianity. So I think someone like Benedict is absolutely crucial. Unlike John Henry Newman, St. Ignatius, or St. Augustine, who left us detailed spiritual autobiographies, the Benedict of history remains a relatively elusive figure. The principal source for his life are the dialogues of St. Pope Gregory the Great, written about 50 years after the death of Benedict. In line with the custom of the time, Gregory's account is massively hagiographical and filled with stories of the fantastic and the miraculous. But from his narrative, we can cull a number of historically reliable details. St. Benedict was born in the region of Nursia, north of Rome, around the year 480, which is to say, just a handful of years after the date generally accepted for the fall of the empire. One can only imagine the cultural and political chaos of that moment. It appears his parents were well-to-do, perhaps nobility, for they had the means to send him to Rome for formal studies. While in the Eternal City, sometime at the beginning of the 6th century, the young Benedict became disgusted with the corruption and lasciviousness of his fellow students. And so he fled from the city and sought, in his own words, to please God alone. Retreating to the country and finding refuge in a cave on a cliffside near the little town of Subiaco, about 45 miles east of Rome. There he lived as a hermit for 3 years. From the 4th to the 6th centuries, some of the best and brightest in both the East and the West took quite literally to the hills to live lives of austerity and poverty and prayer, far from the corruption of the world. Think, for instance, of St. John Chrysostom or St. Jerome or St. Gregory of Nyssa, or even of St. Augustine, who, before he was pressed into service as a bishop, longed to establish a monastery where he and a handful of friends would live lives of simplicity and prayer and study. Now, the spiritual father of all these great figures was St. Anthony of the Desert, who in the 3rd century abandoned a life of ease and comfort, gave all his goods to the poor, and set himself up as a hermit in the Egyptian desert. What was driving these men? It was a deep conviction that the authentic Christian life could not be lived coherently within the ordinary cultural framework of their time. Political confusion, barbarian invasions, and economic instability had a good deal to do with it. But it was also a function of the moral corruption of the period. They felt that they had to create the conditions for a new civilization, precisely by hunkering down, preserving and protecting a form of life which could in time influence the wider culture. The biblical image for this is the Ark of Noah, and we've seen this rhythm often in the history of the Church. Retreat, preservation, reassertion. Perhaps the best example in our time is the hunkering down of the young Karol Wojtyła during a period of massive civilizational crisis, followed by the magnificent reassertion of the Catholic ethos by Pope John Paul II when the propitious moment finally arrived. The 3 years that Benedict spent in the cave of Subiaco was a time of gestation and spiritual deepening. How like the period that St. Ignatius would spend in the cave of Manresa 1,000 years later. His reputation for sanctity was so great that soon other monks came to seek his advice and eventually his leadership. Gregory tells a story of one group of monks who importuned the reluctant Benedict to become their abbot. The hermit gave in, but soon enough the little community was so annoyed by his demanding spiritual style that they tried to poison him. But then we hear that when Benedict asked a blessing over the poisoned cup, it shattered. In time, Benedict established a dozen small monastic communities around Subiaco, and in 530, founded the great house of Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino is a Benedictine monastery that endures to the present day, functioning as the mother house of the worldwide Benedictine family. During his years at Monte Cassino, Benedict labored on the rule for his communities, which in time would exercise a decisive influence on the development of monasticism in the West. St. Gregory tells a charming story from this period of Benedict's life. It has to do with his twin sister, Scholastica, a woman deeply devoted to God. As was her custom, she came to visit her brother in a small building outside the main monastery, and the two of them spoke of theological matters deep into the night. When Benedict announced it was time for him to leave, his sister protested. When he insisted, she simply bowed her head in prayer. Immediately, a terrific storm blew up, which prevented Benedict from leaving. Smiling knowingly at his sister, he remained, and the two of them spoke of divine things until dawn. Not long after this encounter, sometime around the year 540, St. Benedict died.
You mentioned that a Benedict moment might be upon us. Could you elaborate on that?
A lot of people today are talking about that because we're going through a kind of cultural crisis, especially around moral issues. Is it a time to regroup, to retrench, and do what Benedict did himself? As a young man, he left Rome. He said the corruption is so great, he left and then cultivated, for a long period of time, a radical form of the Christian life. And then he was able, if you want, to influence the wider culture. So some are suggesting today we're in a similar moment, that we have to retrench a bit. After Vatican II, there was such a stress on dialogue with the culture, and there's certainly always value to that. But some are suggesting now, is it the moment to withdraw a bit and to rediscover our own radical Christianity? Now, mind you, the ultimate purpose is always to change the world. It's never like to run to the hills and retreat. It's to withdraw perhaps for a time to recover who we are. Because the danger is if all we do is go out into the world, we can lose a sense of what it means to be a Christian. And especially now, when Christianity is so attenuated and so under attack, is it a time to retrench? Ultimately, to return for the transformation of the world. The vehicle by which Benedict was able to wield such decisive influence on the Church and on Western culture was the regula, the rule, that he crafted to guide the lives of his brothers in the monastery. Followed to this day by Benedictines the world over, the rule obviously has relevance for those who adopt the monastic life, but it also had, and has, relevance to those interested in creating a more humane and better ordered society. I will try to keep both of these points of reference in mind as I move through the rule. It was not made up out of whole cloth, but rather emerged from a long tradition of monastic theory and practice. The personal example of Anthony of the Desert, the rule of Augustine, the rule of Basil, the writings of Cassian, all profoundly shaped what Benedict developed. But by far the greatest influence was the so-called Rule of the Master, written around the year 500 by an author whose name has been lost to us. Benedict took all of these sources, thought them through afresh, blended them with ample amounts of scripture and the thinking of the Church Fathers, and produce something new and distinctive. And as history has clearly proved, the rule is of enormous practical value. It's not just spiritually uplifting, it works. The opening word of the rule is of tremendous moment. Obsculta. It means simply listen. The use of this term has very deep roots in the biblical tradition. We recall that at the heart of the original sin was a refusal to abide by the divine word. Assuming the prerogatives of God, Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They made their own egos the criterion of what is right and wrong. This is why the history of salvation commences with someone, Abraham by name, who was willing to listen once more to the word of the Lord. At its best, Israel is a people who listen. In the words of the Shema prayer from the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone." In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul says simply enough, faith comes from hearing. In the very first word of the rule, Benedict is telling his disciples to listen to a higher voice. And through them, he would teach Europe again to attend to that same voice. He goes on, "I address my words to those willing to renounce their own will and take up the strong and noble weapons of obedience." From a biblical perspective, the fundamental problem is always self-will, lack of obedience to, as St. Paul puts it, a power already at work in us that can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Shifting metaphors, Benedict says, let us open our eyes to the divine light. He's fighting against what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the buffered self. An ego that turns in on itself, refusing contact with a transcendent reality. He's saying to his brothers, listen to the voice. Let in the light. If they enter into this project with Benedict, the Master promises that they will constitute together a school of the Lord's service. Once again, he will be teaching them the ways of the Lord in the manner that a master teaches an apprentice. But through them, he will be introducing the wider culture into this great classroom. How easy it is for individuals and entire societies to forget how to listen to the Lord and how to love him. Benedict's monastery will be a training ground. Next, the master speaks of the various types of monks. This might seem a bit technical, perhaps of interest only to historians of monasticism. But a powerful spiritual teaching is on offer here. Benedict mentions first the Cenobites, that is, monks who live in community. These are the monks that he rather clearly favors and of whom the rule will principally treat. Next come the anchorites, or hermits, those who, after a long training in the monastic life, set out on their own for what Benedict called the solitary combat of the desert. It's intriguing that the recommendation here is the opposite of what he himself lived. While Benedict went from hermit to cenobite, he thinks the reverse movement is more spiritually responsible. While the first two types of monks are altogether acceptable, the second two are decidedly not. Benedict speaks of the Cerebites and the Gyrovags. Cerebites are monks living in groups of 3 or 4, without an abbot, and free of any clear monastic rule or discipline. They take what they like from various spiritual traditions and live according to their own lights. We might call them today cafeteria monks. The second objectionable type, and by far the worst kind of monks, are the Gyrovags, those who literally wander around from community to community. In the language of the rule, always on the road, never stable, slaves to their own wills and sensual pleasure. It shouldn't be surprising that what concerns a spiritual teacher writing at the beginning of the 6th century in Italy is individualism, instability, lack of discipline. An entire society was unstable at the time. Therefore, what was needed was a clear spiritual focus and an ordered community life. Wandering about, picking and choosing what one likes, eschewing any authority external to one's own will, these were both causes and effects of the cultural breakdown. Can we recognize something of this gyrovag mentality in the rootlessness and rampant individualism of our own time? After distinguishing the various types of monks, Benedict turns to a consideration of the abbot of the monastery. As many have pointed out, this section of the rule amounts to a self-portrait of Benedict, the father not only of the monasteries that he personally founded, but of the entire monastic family in the West. It is crucial to note that the leader of the monastery is called an abbot, or abbess, which is derived from the Hebrew Abba, the affectionate term for father, which Jesus himself used of God. The abbot is not primarily administrator or bureaucratic director. He is the father of the community, and hence the monks are brothers to one another. This familial emphasis is on clear display throughout the rule. Departing dramatically from the social practice of the time, Benedict insists that the abbot should not be a respecter of persons, that he should not favor the landed, wealthy, and educated over the servile, but should rather be concerned only with the advancement of all in good works. This is a concrete application of St. Paul's principle that in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. Can we sense, at least within the confines of Benedict's monastic community, the beginning of a polity based on equality and the rights of all? Further, when considering a matter of great moment for the entire monastery, the abbot is obliged to consult with all his brothers. For as the rule specifies, often God reveals to the youngest what is best. Also, although he's the supreme legislator within the monastery, the abbot legislates under the direction of God. For again, the rule specifies he must render an account of his decisions before God. The point is, the monarchy of the abbot is not absolute, but is situated within a context of checks and balances, and very much under the rule of law. After carefully delineating the Ten Commandments, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and many of the classical moral excellences, Benedict observes that the cloister of the monastery is, in his words, a workshop of the virtues, a place where one practices the instruments of the spiritual art. Just as an apprentice learns the demands of his discipline under the supervision of his master, so the monk acquires skills in the moral arena under the tutelage of the abbot. This process of spiritual education is implied in the Benedictine vow of conversio morum, conversion of one's way of life. Which of the virtues was most important to Benedict? Even the most cursory reading of the rule would reveal the answer: humility. In fact, he delineates 12 degrees of humility, steps on the way toward a total surrender to God. The first degree is to have before one's eyes at all times the fear of God. This means that one should always have as the top priority doing what God wants and avoiding what God prohibits. The second degree follows immediately upon the first. Not to love one's own will, but that of God, imitating Jesus, who said, "I have come not to do my own will, but the Father's will." These first two recommendations become incarnate through the third degree of humility, always to submit to one's superior in obedience. And the fourth makes this even more pointed: to obey in silence, even when the burden placed on you is hard and unjust. The fifth degree has to do with one's interior life. The willingness to confess to one's abbot or abbess even those wicked thoughts harbored privately, lest one's humility be but an external show. The sixth degree is that Benedictines should be satisfied with their conditions and circumstances, though they may be base and vile. Think how much time and energy we spend on making our homes and apartments just so, and how much inner and outer turmoil this causes. The seventh degree is that the monk not only says with his lips that he is the lowest of all the brothers, but that he actually believes it in his heart. This is not false humility, but rather the perception of self that naturally arises when one is directed toward the infinite goodness of God. This is why the greatest of the saints tend to refer to themselves as the worst of sinners. The 8th degree is that the Benedictine should never do anything unless it is explicitly prescribed by the rule and ordered by the abbot. Self-assertion and the pursuit of one's own projects and plans are fruits of pride.
The 9th degree of humility is particularly difficult for someone such as myself who likes to talk. Benedict recommends that the monk be reluctant to speak, keeping silent until someone asks him something. This might seem a bit severe, but think for a moment. How much mischief has been caused by speech? And how much happier we'd all be if we were more circumspect, more reticent in what we say.
The 10th degree touches on a theme that surfaces frequently in the rule, namely laughter. In opposition to our predilection today, Benedict is rather down on levity. He says, "Do not be inclined or prompt to laugh, for it is written, 'The fool in laughing lifts up his voice.'" Elsewhere he says, "In regard to jokes and words that bring others to laugh, we banish them, always and everywhere."
Well, was he just a killjoy? I don't think so. We have to keep in mind that Benedict was forming his community at a time of almost unprecedented civilizational crisis. A whole new culture had to be constructed, a whole new type of person had to be formed. It just wasn't a time for jokes. Now, having said that, I'm awfully glad there are other great figures in the spiritual tradition much more amenable to laughter. Francis of Assisi, Philip Neri, and G.K. Chesterton come readily to mind.
The 11th degree of humility is much like the 9th. He writes, "In speaking, the monk should express himself calmly, gravely, reasonably, and not raising his voice." Again, think of how many raised and intemperate voices must regularly have been heard in the chaotic wake of the fall of an empire. In place of a society of self-important shouters, Benedict wanted a monastery of humble and recollected monks. Finally, we come to the 12th degree of humility. In whatever he does, whether at work or in choir or in the fields or on a journey, the monk should keep his head down and his eyes fixed on the ground, feeling at all times the weight of his sins. In almost any society, but especially our own, it is usually the case that the proud peacock makes the most headway and gets the most attention. But Benedict is not particularly interested in making headway on worldly paths. He wants monks who walk the road to heaven, and that is always the way of humility. Having considered the types of monks, the role of the abbot, and the fundamental disciplines of the school of virtue, which is the monastery, Benedict turns to what is most essential: prayer, the lifting of the mind and the heart to God. The life of a Benedictine revolves around and is conditioned by prayer. Following the example of the psalmist, who said that he chanted the praises of God 7 times a day. Benedict commands his charges to pray formally 7 times each day. Lauds, or morning prayer, followed by prime, terce, sext, and non. That is to say, prayers at the 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the day, followed by vespers, or evening prayer, and finally compline, or night prayer before retiring. Famously, Benedict tells his followers to prefer nothing to the work of God, by which he means this steady rhythm of prayer. They are told to drop whatever they are doing and head to the place of prayer whenever the bell summons them. And at the heart of these 7 sacred exercises are the Psalms, the great songbook of God's praise. The Psalms express the full range of human emotion, thought, and experience. The psalmist cries, sings, laments, exalts, hopes, despairs, wonders, aspires, doubts, and professes faith. The Benedictine is meant to enter into these prayers in such a profound and regular way that they become as natural as breathing. Along with prayer, the other essential aspect of the Benedictine life is work. Hence the famous adage, ora et labora. Now, to be sure, work was, and is, essential to the practical functioning of the monastery. But in the mind of Benedict, it had a profound spiritual purpose as well. In the section of the rule dealing with the cellarer, for example, Benedict says that he should treat the objects and possessions of the monastery as the sacred objects of the altar. The point is that the most ordinary work, farming and harvesting, cleaning, cooking, should be seen as a means of giving praise to the Lord.
Just as the monk enters daily into the rhythm of the Psalms, so he enters daily into the rhythm of work on behalf of his brothers. In chapter 48 of the Rule, Benedict specifies that laziness is the enemy of the soul, and so urges his charges to dedicate certain hours every day to manual labor and to spiritual reading. We remark that everyone in the monastery, from the best educated and most noble to the simplest and most base, is required to work with his hands, and that the study of spiritual things is construed by Benedict as a type of work. And how wonderfully this anticipates the literally civilization-saving work, both in scriptoria and fields, that the sons of Benedict would accomplish in the course of the centuries.
We have already seen how Benedict privileges the cenobitic, or community life, over the eremitic, or hermit's path. The stress on community can be found over and over again in the Rule. Brothers and sisters should learn to obey one another. Younger monks and nuns should defer to their elders and seek their blessing. Those who harm the community should immediately do penance. Absent brothers and sisters should be prayed for. Errant brothers and sisters should be corrected. Respect should be shown to all. The godly life for Benedict is a life in common, and his family of God, properly ordered and disciplined, would in time become the foundation for wider communities, villages, towns, and cities. Another key feature of the rule is its stress upon radical poverty. Chapter 33, which considers the question whether Benedictines ought to hold any private property, commences in this striking manner. Praecipive hoc vitium radicitus amputandum est de monasterio. This vice of property must be radically cut out of the monastery. He specifies that no monk should ever presume to give or receive anything without the explicit permission of the abbot, nor to possess anything as his own. As the rule has it, neither books, nor tablets, nor a stylus for writing. In a word, absolutely nothing.
Indeed, everything must be held in common. Omniaque omnium sint communia, says the rule. At the very end of his life, Thomas Merton commented that the communist idea of shared ownership is impossible to achieve at the political level and yet remains a monastic ideal. St. Benedict seems to be following here the New Testament idea that the first followers of Jesus placed their goods at the feet of the apostles to be distributed to each according to need. Unless a civilization is grounded in something more substantial than money-making and the accumulation of material goods, it will inevitably collapse. In stressing poverty so radically, the rule was opening the Western mind to those spiritual values which would alone sustain a culture.
One of the most remarkable features of the Benedictine life is an openness to the welcoming of guests. Chapter 53 of the rule begins with this straightforward remark: all the guests who arrive should be received as Christ. Benedict says that the moment visitors are announced, the superior and the community should hasten to greet them and show every mark of respect. Throughout the guest stay, the community should indicate to them by a nod of the head or a prostration of the body that they are adoring the Christ they see in them. The superior, or a designated member of the community, should accompany visitors at prayer. And the monks should break their own fast so as to eat hospitably with the guests. Moreover, the abbot himself should wash the hands of any visitor. Furthermore, the rule is clear that every Benedictine house should have a guest master so as to assure that there is adequate lodging for visitors.
I can personally testify that these rules are still followed. I've been received at Benedictine houses around the world with extraordinary hospitality. When I arrived at the great monastery of Citeaux in France, the abbot did indeed wash my hands in the presence of the entire community. As many have indicated, this almost exaggerated openness to visitors has prevented Benedictine life from turning in on itself, becoming withdrawn and sectarian. Even as they have cultivated a radical, distinctive form of Christianity, Benedictines have known from the beginning that their life is ultimately for the world.
It is absolutely no accident, therefore, that the Benedictine monasteries became, in time, centers of civilization and not simply places of retreat. Benedict saw his brotherhood as, in one sense, looking backward, and in another sense, looking forward. The radical way of life encouraged by the rule was meant to echo the manner of life described in the Acts of the Apostles. And it was meant to anticipate the fullness of community that will be found in heaven. Poor, humble, obedient, prayerful, welcoming, and radically devoted to God. The Benedictine was and is a light to the world and an ambassador of God.
And the first word in the rule is listen. And that seems to have some relevance today, too.
Oh, enormous, I think. And many have commented upon that. Listen. And it echoes the great Shema prayer of the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is God alone. Listen. See, our problem is we have to run the show. We're in charge. We speak. That's a basic human problem. But listening to a higher voice, there's a higher voice that's calling us to do great things. And if we listen to that, then something great spiritually will happen. Especially today, I think, when we're all so addicted to, our machines and our activity and going from here to there. We're kind of ADD culture. Stop, listen, take the time, attend, is a hugely important spiritual lesson today. The fact that this young kid, Benedict, goes out and sits in a cave for 3 years. What's he doing? Well, to a large degree, he's listening. He's listening to hear a higher voice. How many of us have the spiritual discipline, even the psychological discipline, to do that? So I think that's a wonderful word for our time. Listen. As I said at the outset, Benedict of Nursia is arguably the most pivotal of all the figures we're considering in this series. Think about this. St. Paul employed the Roman roads for the preaching of the gospel. The first popes used the legal and administrative structure of the Roman Empire to give stability to the church. Jerome, Tertullian, Augustine, many others took advantage of the Latin language and the conceptual clarity that Rome had inherited from ancient Greece to think through the Christian mysteries. There was therefore the real fear that with the collapse of Roman order, Christianity would simply implode. It was the signal accomplishment of Benedict and his disciples to have preserved the best of the Roman culture and then to use it as a matrix for the further development and propagation of the Christian faith.
At one of the most crucial moments in history, Benedict preserved a form of life that would eventually shape the civilization of the world. It is unquestionably true that anyone who reverences Socrates, Demosthenes, and Pythagoras, and anyone who calls with confidence on the name of Christ, owes an enormous debt to St. Benedict of Nursia.